Buenas tardes, bienvenidos, muchísimas gracias.
Well, good afternoon, welcome, thanks for being on this Hay Vida Martes. I love these meetings. This is the best way to complete a Tuesday. This day in the middle of the week, you don't know what to do in the afternoon, so coming to a place like this is the best way to complete this day. Those of you who have been here before, you know how this works. But for those of you who are new, we have 6 Martians, what we call Martians. These people between 16 and 21 years old that are the only ones that are allowed to pose questions to our guests, Esteban and David. For the rest of you, you will have the possibility to pose questions to our guests through Twitter with the hashtag Vida Martes. On this account, which is at Espacio FTFEF, and I will ask these questions to the guests throughout this hour. Of course, today we have here Enrique Flores, who's a sketcher. He will be sketching live everything that goes on here, what he thinks should be sketched. We will be showing the sketches of this presentation throughout this hour, so an applause for all of you. And now we'll get serious. Climate emergency. This is how we call what's happening since right before summer. This is a change in our perspective. This is a fine-tuning of the machine. We want to emphasize what's going on. We are going into the time of the rush, the time of emergency. This was in May because The Guardian updated its style book and recommended not to use the term climate change, but to use climate crisis or climate emergency, and also climate skeptics to climate science negationists. These are important changes, and the goal, according to The Guardian, is to reflect in an accurate way the phenomenon being described. The term climate change sounds too passive and calm, when actually what scientists are speaking of is a catastrophe for humanity. David Wallace-Wells used to be a collaborator in The Guardian. He's a journalist, but he's got this special view of historians. He's got a degree in history from Brown University, and he is deputy editor of New York Magazine. He's a New Yorker, so he'll be speaking in English. David is now denouncing the problem with the climate that we are seeing, and also he's got this book, The Uninhabitable Planet, Life After.
Lo describe su editorial, no es una advertencia, sino que es una certificación del futuro.
Life After Warming. So this is a way of certifying the future that is about to come. I give the floor to David Wallace-Wells.
Thank you, gracias. Thank you, all of you, for coming. Apologies in advance for talking in English, but I hope I'll be able to communicate the scale of this story even in a different language. I'm here to talk about climate change, but it makes me a little uncomfortable doing that, even though I've spent a few years researching the subject and have now written a book about it, because I've never really thought of myself as an environmentalist. I don't even think of myself as what we call in English a nature person. I've never gone on a hike. I've never gone camping. I've never owned any pets. I lived my whole life in cities, in fact, just one city, New York. And I always thought that nature was something that was happening elsewhere, far away from me, and that modern life protected me against its forces. In all those ways, I think I was quite like a lot of people in the world, a lot of people I know, who had been living complacently and deludedly about the threat of climate change. And the more time I spent in this research, looking at the saga of global warming, the more I understood that it wasn't just one delusion that I had about climate change, it was three. And I think it's worth talking about each in turn. The first is about the speed of change. I had been taught, I read in my newspapers and saw in my TV programs for decades that climate change was a slow story. It started with the Industrial Revolution, and it had fallen to us to clean up the mess left behind by our grandparents and their grandparents, so that our grandchildren wouldn't have to deal with the results. It was a story of centuries. But in fact, half of all of the emissions that have ever been produced in the entire history of humanity have been produced in just the last 30 years. That's since Al Gore published his first book on warming, and it's since the UN established its IPCC climate change panel. We've done more damage since then than in all the centuries, in fact, all the millennia that came before. That means we've done more damage with full knowledge of what we were doing than we ever managed to do in ignorance, which is especially concerning when we think about what we have to do going forward. Not just know the problem, but deal with it, respond to it. We're now beginning to see the impacts of climate change in real time. Those are arriving much faster than predicted as well. Unprecedented heat waves, droughts, famines, seeing hurricane after hurricane in the Caribbean, wildfires burning much larger areas of land than was the case 50 or 75 years ago. In Houston a few weeks ago, one storm hit that was called a 500-year storm. It's a storm that you would expect to hit once every 500 years. Houston has been hit by 5 of them in the last 5 years. This is a storm of such scale and intensity, you would expect to see it only once since Europeans arrived in the Americas. And we've seen 5 of them in Houston in just the last 5 years. But the speed of change is just the first of the delusions. The second is about the scope of change. I felt growing up that when I heard about climate change, I only heard about it in terms of sea level rise. And that made me feel that if I lived anywhere but on the coast, I was safe. In fact, the more that you know about the economic impacts, which could cut GDP by 20 or 30% from where it would be without climate change by the end of the century, to the agricultural impacts, which could mean that our agriculture is only half as bountiful as it is today, to the effect on war, which could double or more by the end of the century if we don't change course. You realize that this is not a story that can be compartmentalized, and no matter where you are, what kind of person you are, how wealthy you are, you can't escape its force. It is an all-encompassing story. In fact, it is the theater in which all of us are living our lives today and will be living them in the future. There's almost no aspect of modern life that you can imagine that is unaffected by climate change, and that will become only more so in the decades ahead when our politics and our geopolitics, our culture, our relationship to technology and to capitalism, our sense of our place in nature, and our sense of the shape of history, all of which will be changed, in most cases damaged, by climate change. So that's the second problem. I think most of us understood climate change as distant, compartmentalizable, mostly a matter of sea level rise. But the third big delusion that I had was about the severity, just how bad it could be. Scientists often talk about 2 degrees of warming. They say this is catastrophic. The island nations of the world call that level genocide. And I felt hearing scientists talk about this issue and always saying we have to do everything we can to avoid it, that meant 2 degrees was about a worst case scenario. It was about as bad as things could get. In fact, practically speaking, based on where we are now, it's something much closer to a best case scenario, with a whole range of much more horrifying outcomes warmer than 2 degrees, at 3 degrees, at 4 degrees. But at just 2 degrees, which I think is, practically speaking, an inevitable level of warming, damage from storms and sea level rise will grow 100-fold from where they are today. Cities in the South Asia and the Middle East will be so hot in summer that you won't be able to walk around outside without risking heat stroke or death. These are cities that today are home to 10 or 12 or 15 million people, which is one reason why the UN expects that at just 2 degrees of warming, which will probably reach around 2040 or 2050, we could be dealing with hundreds of millions of climate refugees. Also at 2 degrees, we would have locked in and made certain the total loss of the planet's ice sheets, which over centuries would bring 80 meters of sea level rise, enough to drown 2/3 of the world's major cities if we didn't move them. Now, this all seems quite terrifying, but there is also, I think, a bit of a silver lining, which is that when we're thinking about these worst-case outcomes and are horrified by them, we can feel paralyzed. They seem that big. But ultimately, the size of those impacts, the incredible economic impacts, the effect on war, on agriculture, these are a sign, a reflection of our power over the climate. If we get to those scenarios, it will only be because of what we have chosen to do from here on out. Our hands are on those levers because the main driver of climate change is human action, and we can choose to drive the story in another direction and make the planet much more livable, much more prosperous, much more comfortable, and much more just, if we choose to. The challenges are enormous. I don't want to overstate my own optimism, but the only obstacles that stand in our way are human ones. Science isn't stopping us from taking action, and technology isn't stopping us from taking action. If we had better tools, we might be able to move a little more quickly, but we have the tools we need today to begin, and the only thing stopping us is our politics and our economics and our culture. But time is running out, and we need to change those systems if we have a hope of stabilizing the planet's climate at something that you and I and everyone in this room would recognize as comfortable and livable. The UN says we have about 10 years to cut in half our carbon emissions and stay safely below 2 degrees. They say that would require a global World War II scale mobilization. And I think everyone here can agree we're not doing that. Nevertheless, we've seen incredible progress just over the last year. I turned in the manuscript to my book last September. I had never heard of Greta Thunberg. Extinction Rebellion had not even been formed in the UK. The Sunrise Movement had not announced itself in the US, where we hadn't even elected Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to Congress. Today we are already living, just 1 year later, in a completely different world, with many more political possibilities open to us than seemed conceivable just a year ago. Given the timeline, I think we're still not moving fast enough, but finally, for the first time in my lifetime, we're moving in the right direction. Thank you. You guys want to come up and... Just stay up here.
Muchísimas gracias, David. Quédate conmigo.
Thank you very much, David. Now we will have Esteban Manrique. He's the director of the Royal Botanic Garden. Please take a seat. Well, as you know, you can post any questions with the hashtag Vida Martes. And the book by David, he won't be able to sign it at the end of this session because he needs to run to the airport. But there is a stand where you can get a copy of the book. I don't know if I should use the translation. Well, dear colleagues, I'll start with Greta. Greta is teenager, Greta Thunberg. She is the age of our Martians. She sits each Friday demonstrating before the Swedish Parliament, and she's a symbol against climate change nowadays. What has happened? How she has been able to mobilize all these people? Because she's not the first youngster to express her worries about the future and that tells of the politicians. Is this related with social networks, or is it because we're in a point where things are getting too serious?
Factors. I think that the fact that the world is really waking up to this crisis for the first time is an important part of it. I think that we see on our television screens and our newspapers the news of extreme weather nearly every day. And so for the first time, we're not thinking of climate change as being a distant threat, one that we have to think about in the future, but one that is with us today. And I think that's made all of us much more receptive to people who are raising the alarm. I also think social media is a big part of it. I think that, especially considering that she is a socially uncomfortable teenager with no friends before she started this project, it's really to the credit of her social media savvy and the engagement that she's had with people through Instagram and Twitter that she has acquired the stature that she has. But I also think quite a lot of it has to do with her own particular skill set and qualifications. I think she is incredibly clear about the state of the science and is very careful not to overstate the state of the science. She comes with a very simple message, which is the scientists are telling us the world is in crisis. Why are our leaders not responding? And that is an incredibly powerful and clear message. Many other climate activists and advocates, even those who have joined her on the climate strikes and in other protest movements, are also coming with particular policy proposals, particular political critiques, particular theories about who is sinned and who is virtuous in this fight. And she is approaching it with a much more simple, straightforward description of the world as she sees it. I'm told that things are falling apart and no one in power is responding. Why? I think that's been very powerful, and I think it's been helpful for her to focus on the generational aspect in which a teenager can say to all the adults of the world, you are ruining the planet for me. Why? What is the possible justification for that? I think it also helps that she has a quite flat, careful affect, that she seems even younger than her years. She doesn't seem like a adolescent on fire with, hormones and anger. She's, up until her speech at the UN last week, was always very controlled, very careful. And I think therefore sort of seemed to people who encountered her almost even more like a child than like a teenager, and yet a very wise child who was coming armed with all of the world's scientific wisdom to confront the powerful people at the UN, in London, at the EU, wherever she's gone. And I think her courage in those encounters and her integrity of purpose has been really clear for everyone to see. She does not change her message when she's talking to the world's most powerful people. In fact, in certain ways, she intensifies it. And that's a really impressive and moving commitment to the cause. And I think it shows just how single-mindedly she views this challenge, which is not something she's doing to get acclaim or power. It's because she really is as concerned as she says she is and doesn't understand why the whole world isn't exactly as focused on climate change as she is. And frankly, I don't really understand that either.
Los mensajes sencillos calan mejor. Sencillos.
Well, simple messages work better. Well, I wanted to add something related with these young people. We have mentioned this before the session when we were speaking of Greta Thunberg, and I said I'm older, and I think it's easy. It has been easy to live in this climate and having time to compare. I was when I was 16, I realized how was life. I've been in Madrid, living in Madrid for over 60 years, and I can compare to what we have now. So it's easier for me to realize changes, to see how it has changed. For me, it calls my attention how someone young and like Greta or David, how they have realized how things have changed, how things were before, and now they have made the decision to say, I don't want to do this to go on, because I want things to be like they were before. And I think this is incredible. And another thing I like to say is I like to know how many of us here are coming here to see if they can be convinced, because they don't believe, they don't see this crisis, this climate crisis, because they don't have enough reasons. I like to know whether the people here are convinced, so it'll be easier to share our points of view. But I like to know if there's someone here who doesn't believe. Why do I say this? Because it'll be great that these people that reject climate change, that say climate change does not exist, that there has always been climate change, and it'll be great if we can change their opinion. Is there anyone that wants to raise their hand and say, I'm not convinced, I want to be convinced? I don't know if there's none or nobody dares to raise their hand. Okay, we are all friends, we are all on the same team. We are all convinced. Well, I think this is very good, but I like that in sometimes some of these panels we could have people that are not convinced, but I think people that are not convinced, they don't want to be convinced. They are living their life in a very good way. They just don't want to know about what could be a reason to do things in a different way, in a way that they don't believe. These are those who don't want to listen, don't want to learn. David, what would you tell these people that are negationists of the climate change, or according to the Guardian style book? Well, I don't find the term, but those who don't believe what the scientists are saying.
I think from the perspective of the people in this room who believe in climate change, I think it's actually important to understand that there are not that many people who don't. According to polls in the US, which is maybe the world's greatest hotbed of climate denial, 70 to 80% of Americans believe in climate change and believe that it's concerning. That's too high for my taste. I wish the number of non-believers was 0, not 20 or 25. But 25% of Americans believe that aliens live on planet Earth among us. And I don't think we're handing our space policy over to those people. So we don't need to worry that much about handing our climate policy over to those who don't believe. In Europe, the numbers are even higher, as high as 90% believe. For me, the problem is more that there are a large number of people who believe that this is real and happening, but aren't all that concerned about it, who take seriously the science and the projections, but who aren't willing themselves to endure meaningful changes to their lives and don't want to see politics really prioritize action on climate. They'd rather see their politics focus on things they find a little bit more immediate in their self-interest. But to those who don't believe, I would point to the intensity of storms, the growing rate of wildfires, the simple measurement of the temperature increase that has been going up very predictably for almost half a century now, precisely in accordance with predictions that could have been made 150 years ago based on our most basic understanding of the greenhouse effect. If we had just taken those algorithms developed in the 19th century and input how much carbon we've added to the system, we would have come out with a prediction for how much warming we've had that was very, very close to where we are today. And then there are those, as you mentioned, who say, well, the planet has always had climate change. And that's true. The last time the planet had as much carbon in the atmosphere as it has today, there were palm trees in the Arctic, and the equator was so hot that nothing like a mammal would have been able to survive. The planet is already hotter than it has ever been in the entire course of human history, which means we've evolved and developed agriculture and civilization and modern civilization in response to and as a result of climate conditions that we've already left behind. So we're already living almost on another planet with a different climate, and we have to figure out what of the civilization that we've brought with us can survive these new conditions and what we'll have to discard. Now, it's going to get a lot worse. Almost certainly we're going to have twice as much warming as we have today, which means all of the pressures that we're seeing today will get dramatically worse. But ultimately, as I mentioned a bit in my speech, it's a kind of a comfort to know that this is human-caused. And there are deniers who will say, okay, I admit the world is warming, but it's not the cause of humans. But to me, if it was out of our control, if we had nothing to do with it, that would be even more terrifying. Because then we would be careening on a suicidal path with no control at all. On some level, it's a comfort to know that it's us that's doing the damage, even if we also know that humans can be brutal and indifferent and short-sighted and bad actors, bad politicians in all the ways that we know, because in theory at least, we can engineer a new politics to take control of the situation. But that requires not just convincing those people who don't believe, but I think more importantly, persuading those people who are aware to be much more concerned and to prioritize climate action as though it was a first-order political priority and an existential crisis, which I think it is.
Vamos a abrir el diálogo a nuestros marcianos.
Okay, we will open dialogue to our Martians. Okay, who's got the first question?
Sí, está. Hello. Who should read this book? Is it a book designed and every teenager should read this, or some other persons? That's my question.
Well, I wrote it really for the person that I was a couple of years ago before I started really caring about climate change. So that means I was an engaged consumer of the news, was following reports here and there, but felt myself really ignorant of the full scale and scope and urgency of the crisis. And I wanted to communicate to that person just how dramatic the changes could be. I didn't think of it in terms of ages. I think, anyone from a teenager on up should be capable of it. And it's also a book that you can dip in and out of. There's large chunks of it that are quite dense with science, which you can sort of, get the point of and flip past. But the full picture that accumulates over several hundred pages of a world that will be really fundamentally transformed, I think is quite important for us all to process, because we've been trained, I think, and taught to think of climate change as one challenge among many that we're facing. And there's some wisdom in that, but it also has an impact on everything that you could possibly care about in the world. And if you want to secure a future that involves economic growth and low levels of violence and no famine and social stability and political stability, if you want to secure any future that resembles those hopeful futures, it means taking control of the system quite quickly. And I think doing so requires a much stronger sense of urgency than almost anyone up to this point has had. And I'm really grateful for and moved by all the political movements we've seen in the last year, because it shows at least that the younger generation is embracing that sense of urgency in a way that those of us who are a bit older, and even quite a lot older, have failed to do.
¿Quieres añadir algo?
Sí, a mí me gustaría.
Would you like to add anything else? Yes, I would like to add that it's a book that will enable you to gather all the data and scientific evidence in a very short time without having to resource to all the books that he has read and all the information that he has gathered that might have taken him a long time. And in a very short time, you can gather all the reasons, not only for yourself, because if you're reading this book, you're probably already convinced, but also to deliver this conviction and this message to other people who are hesitant and who do not believe in this, because there is a scientific reasoning behind all this, and you have a very good summary of all the information that he has gathered in these 400 pages. And this, for us who are a bit profane and are not knowledgeable in the topic, makes our life very easy. We are going to see now what our in-house sketcher is doing. He already has one of the sketches that he has drawn. We can see it on the screen. I have lived long enough to be able to make comparisons, Esteban says. We're running out of time, says David. The only obstacle is ourselves. The third wrong concept is the seriousness. Climate emergency with capital letters. This is where we are right now. The newspapers, the media, let's talk about them. Have we given enough attention to the climate change? A few years ago, we started seeing new sections devoted to the environment in the newspapers, covering things related to the energies and the climate change. But when the journalist crisis started, all these sections also were taken out of the media. Nowadays, we see that they are coming back, and it's still somewhat complicated, and until very recently it was quite difficult to sell a piece of news about climate change, because they were talking about forecasts for the future and nothing was happening after that. So what is your opinion on what journalists have been doing up to now?
The story. We failed to tell the story adequately. But I think that failure is quite systemic. I think our political leaders have failed to address it. I think our business leaders have failed to address it. It probably shouldn't surprise us all that much that journalists have failed to do justice to the story as well. But I wrote my book out of frustration with existing storytelling conventions, existing journalism about climate change, which I felt was so focused on seeming responsible and careful that it actually misled the public in many of the ways I talked about earlier. I think most people still today don't understand the severity of the crisis, even though we've learned a lot more over the last few years. And I do think that journalism has made a lot of progress over the last few years. It used to be the case in the US that you could say climate change is the most important story of our time, and yet it never appears on the front pages of our newspapers. But these days it does appear on the front pages of our newspapers a couple of times a week. The Guardian in the UK is doing especially good work also on that. I think our television journalism has been less impressive, and I think on some level it's more important. It's also more powerful because those images are so dramatic. When I think about how much the California wildfires really taught the world that climate change is here and terrifying, and that you can't escape it no matter how rich or famous you are, I think that that was an event that, for all of its horror and tragedy, could have been used even more powerfully by the television media than they were. And I think, truthfully, climate change is handing us these opportunities every day. It's grotesque because each of them is a disaster and involves suffering, but the world is already being punished by climate change, and I think we could do a much better job of telling those stories and making sure that when we do tell them, that we are including the climate context and not just describing a natural disaster as though it's an act of God. You know, for a very long time, we related to the weather as though it was outside of our control. Who knew what caused it? What could we do to control it? I think we're just now beginning to wake up to the idea that, in fact, we are at least partially responsible for a lot of these events, but I think the media could do a much better job of connecting those dots.
¿Cómo lo ves, Esteban, como científico? Yo creo que cuando los científicos habéis...
Esteban, as a scientist, when scientists have started to speak out and say very loud and very clearly that things are happening, sea levels are rising for real, but until the moment that you started telling us, well, the media did not have the headlines to deliver. we're not only saying that things are happening, we are actually registering everything that is going on so we can analyze it later, and after these analyses we can get to conclusions. There's a before and an after. Up until very recently, the uncertainty of these forecasts made by scientists was a great uncertainty. Anything could happen within a certain range of values. But since we are starting to see that the evidence is growing and data are accumulating, the uncertainty is decreasing, and we are about 5% of uncertainty about things not happening. So this means that we are quite certain about things that are happening. Obviously, there is still a certain amount of things that we cannot be sure about because technologies are not as developed as to allow us to know 100% that something is going to happen. But we see that the trend is shown, and they tell us that the increase in temperature has a lot to do with human activity, and the uncertainty is very tiny. And this is very important. This reflects a before and after. Nobody can deny this, at least nobody who has read and has understood this scientific evidence. Another big turning point has to do with the mass media. Maybe 1-2 years ago, journalists talked about climate change, but they also spoke about the non-climate change, that this was not actually happening. So I think that now it looks like many journalists have sort of signed an agreement, a charter. I think there is about 150 media who have signed a charter that establishes that they will not talk about climate change if not supported by scientific evidence. But not long ago, a journalist in a Spanish newspaper in Expansión published an article with the headline, "Hurricanes and the Lies of the Environmentalists." This has forced many scientists to ask the journal, the newspaper, to let us publish a counter article that I think was published yesterday. And we want to thank all the journalists who are committed with science, because this is really what's supporting all the knowledge that we can provide and all the actions that we can undertake. Also, I want to add that this is not only something that has to do with climate change. This is also related to burning fossil fuels, with the warming of the atmosphere. But there are also other human activities that are related, for instance, with the abandonment of certain lands, or the use of too much nitrogen when working the soils. And many elements are adding up to the same phenomenon. It's not only a series of a chain of events, but also this is supported by, let's say, collateral aspects that actually facilitate the climate change. And the global change is the consequence. And there are many things that are giving us warning signals that even though we cannot go back to the way we were, at least we need to stop the change that is ongoing right now. We know that the movement will not be stopped very quickly, but we need to know that in the next 100 or 150 years, the change will not go on. David has mentioned before the speed with which this change is taking place. Changes have been ongoing over history, but never as fast as we are experiencing them now. And this is what really scares us, because in just 150 years, the concentration of carbon dioxide has increased almost 25%. When I was younger, when they told me about the concentrations of carbon dioxide, it was about 350 parts per million. Now we're talking about 420 parts per million. And I'm not talking about what's going on in Spain, but of a global average, of a global mean. And I'm even including those places that are not affected by the pollution, and about those places where actually the atmosphere, the air pollution has been diluted. So this has been proven scientifically, and only the blind cannot see what they don't want to see. We're talking about certitudes now. We receive a question through Twitter with the hashtag Vida Martes. This is a question for David. Eduardo Robaina says that what has been the biggest mistake that you have made in terms of communicating climate science in the past?
I'm not sure that I've made many mistakes, but I think I speak for the industry as a whole in saying that we were too focused on being careful and cautious and too worried about scaring people, that we were reluctant as journalists to be honest and transparent about what the science was saying. And I think in some ways that was because we were taking cues from scientists who are also themselves quite cautious and wanting to be careful and responsible with the science. But I think it's unfortunate because, as I say, it's resulted in a less informed public than we would have had otherwise. And I think it's important to understand when thinking about errors, science evolves and revises its own predictions. Not every scientific paper that I summarize in my book is going to come to pass exactly as it's projected to. That's science. Some will be probably better than scientists expect, but the recent history of research shows that in almost every case, we are revising our projections in a darker direction, so that what the kind of warming we're expecting at, say, 2030 or 2050 is now somewhat significantly higher than the amount we were looking for a few decades ago. The same is true of Arctic melt and sea level rise and many of these other particular impacts. And when you think that this is a book of several hundred pages, whole chunks of which are, every single sentence is a new scientific paper that's being referenced, you think, half of those papers could be totally wrong, and we would still end up in a totally terrifying situation. And I think that is the big picture context to understand when we're assessing the question of scientific certainty. Surely some of the things we're hearing about today are not going to be exactly right. We're going to be revising those findings. But when you understand that it's not a matter of science being right or science being wrong, it's a matter of hundreds of thousands of findings, all of which point in exactly the same direction, including conducted by scientists who are revisiting other scientists' work and trying to prove them wrong. And yet the overwhelming majority of that research points in a single direction and says the world is getting much more difficult to live in, much more quickly than we had hoped to see, and we're not doing anything about it at the scale that is required. You understand that, again, there can be enormous errors in the scientific community. I don't think we're going to get 50% error rate. I think we're going to be talking about 5% or something like that. But even if it were 50%, that wouldn't be a comfort, because we would still be living in an incredibly damaged world by these forces. And so I think the question of scientific uncertainty or scientific mistakes, it's almost a red herring. The consensus is so strong that we can even account for a large error rate and still know that we need to take action immediately and at large scale to secure a future that we would all consider livable and comfortable and prosperous.
Segunda Martiana, segunda pregunta.
Second question from the Martians. Hello, my name is Vega. I would like to ask you if you think that the movement against climate change is based on ethical reasons, or is it just fashionable? Because since everyone is demonstrating here, I want to join them as well.
Social movements have an element of fashion to them. I think that's how change happens. If we were dependent only on those people who are committing their entire lives to this cause, nothing would really ever change. But thankfully, because of the culture of social pressure and contagion, we do have social change, and it usually begins with particularly committed people speaking in particularly clear-eyed ways about the the issue that they're concerned with and bringing people along to their cause, some of whom are there because they are persuaded and are convinced entirely, others who are maybe not quite as persuaded but still think it's something to worry about and change, and other people who are just there for the scene. But I don't think that's a problem. I think the changes that we need on climate are so large that we require a mass movement to support them. And that means that we need to have a climate movement that accommodates even people who are not especially committed, but who want to see the world preserved anyway, who don't want to see dramatic changes in their own lives, but want to see the climate stabilized nevertheless. I think if we get into a position where we're saying to people in the climate movement that you're not allowed to be here because you don't really care enough, you haven't given up meat, therefore you don't qualify, you haven't given up air travel, therefore you don't qualify, then you're reducing the possible size of support for dramatic action at the time that we need the most support. Personally, I would say that the vast majority of people who are marching in the streets are there because they're concerned about climate. I don't think the proportion of people who are there just because it's cool is very large. But if that number gets larger because more people are there just for the scene, I don't object to that. I think it's the most important thing is to get as many people moving in the right direction, calling for change as we possibly can.
Esteban, ¿tú irías por la foto de Instagram?
Esteban, what do you think? I fully agree with what David has said. I don't care if it's a fashion. I think that the important thing is for people to move. I think we are running out of time, and it's a matter of time that people who are really convinced can share their message and convince the rest of the people about what's going on, and especially because they have the scientific basis. It's not something that they're making up, and it's not something that is related to what you like or dislike. Maybe somebody might think so, but it's not a matter of taste. It's a matter of what's really going on and supported by the science. It's something that is happening very fast in a span that really goes beyond our lives. So it's necessary that the new generations can actually continue the work. And I don't mind if somebody goes to any demonstration because their friends are going, if these friends can actually count on him or her to join the movement to support the fight against climate change. David, why a little sheep? Sorry, a little bee. I couldn't see it. It's...
We're living through a mass extinction right now. There have been significant die-offs of nearly all of the world's species. We have, according to the World Wildlife Foundation, 60% less mammals alive today than were alive in just 1970. And the effect on insects is even more dramatic. There have been studies showing as much as 70 or 80% of insect populations have disappeared over recent decades. Now, this isn't only the result of climate change. It also has to do with habitat transformation and ecosystem disruption and pesticides. It's a complicated story, but climate change is part of it. And if we lose the support of our bees and our insects, it really will disrupt much of the plant biosphere of the planet. Now, I'm actually surprised, given the numbers that we've seen for how much insects have declined, that we haven't already seen quite dramatic impacts on plant life. And it may be that that means that those studies are slightly overstating the rate of decline. But in the big picture, we talked about some of these earlier eras in the Earth's past where we've had climate change. The species that were alive during those periods were not comfortable. In each of them, there was a mass extinction, meaning at least 50, and in at least one case, at least 95% of all life on Earth died. We are living through one of those mass extinctions today based on human activity, and I think the bee is a symbol of that decline, that collapse. I think we can still stabilize some amount of the Earth's ecosystems and protect some of the world's species, and in particular, I think we can do enough to support human life going forward. I don't think that climate change is going to bring about the extinction of humans, but if we're living in a planet in which 60 or 70% of all species die off, that won't be good for us no matter how resilient and adaptable we are we're so dependent on the natural world for everything we do that declines at this speed and at this scale will really transform everything about the way that we live here on this planet. And so even though it's happening to animals, not to us, they're very much a concern and worth focusing on.
Va a cambiar el dibujo de...
This is going to really change the picture of the world. Agriculture is going to become different as well. So what can botanical gardens do in this respect? Well, that's a very nice question. Thank you very much. Botanical gardens can do a lot. In fact, there has been recently a meeting last year in Melbourne in Australia in December. We think that botanical gardens actually are reservoirs for biodiversity, both from local biodiversity and beyond. I think we can do a lot for us to understand why some of these plants find it difficult to survive the climate change, and we can teach the managers of the environment where these botanical gardens are located what to do with these plants so that they do not disappear from the planet, or suggest what they can plant and so that the species do not disappear. So the alliance that we have agreed among the botanical gardens against climate change is a very positive initiative. And in terms of the plant species, there's a lot that we can do because we are the reservoirs of this biodiversity. And bees are a symbol too, because there are very little insects that are not only affected by the rise of the temperature of the atmosphere, but also by other human activities that we are not doing right. And in this sense, I love it that you included a little bee in the cover of your book, because it's a symbol that can be easily understood by everyone. We have seen and heard for long already that bees are disappearing, and that many of the foods that we eat are actually endangered. And I think this is actually key. Very recently, scientific paper that has just been published in a very prestigious journal from Lancaster tells that in the United Kingdom, 1/3 of the plant biodiversity connected to well-spread ecosystems has disappeared already. This goes against our own capacity for adapting as humans. We can live in many places and in very different conditions, but we need to see how long and to what extent we can stretch this capacity, because as David says, the life is not going to disappear, it will just be redistributed. By the way, the bee on the cover is it's not looking so good, by the way.
Venezuela, a known third world country. So looking at this climate change problem from that perspective, I wanted to ask do you think that first world countries are not doing much to solve the global warming crisis? Because first, they know that they can obtain an economic benefit from it, and two, because they know that the main consequences are directed to undeveloped countries.
Well, I think it's absolutely the case that the first world is failing this test. Although it's also the case that nations in the first world are reducing their emissions where nations in the developing world are not, but that's probably as it should be, because we are in a position that we can make changes, and it'll be much harder for the nations of the global south. I think the two problems you describe are really significant ones and go a long way to explaining the state that we're in. The first one, thankfully, I think has a sort of a happy near-term prognosis or solution, in the sense that for a very long time it was understood to be the case that there was little economic benefit to taking action on climate change. In fact, most of the economists of the world, until very recently, would have said that climate change didn't even represent a meaningful economic risk. As a result, most of the governments of the world who prioritized economic growth weren't interested in taking action to protect the climate. But just over the last few years, there's been a massive change in the perspective of the economics profession. And now almost every economist you talk to would tell you that we will be better off in relatively short order if we take faster action rather than slower action. I don't think we've yet gotten to the point where that has totally transformed our politics and our policy, but I think it probably will in relatively short order. And I think it's one reason why you've begun to see at least some nations in the first world making bolder proclamations about their actions going forward. So you have in the UK, a conservative parliament actually declared a climate emergency and committed to going zero carbon by 2050. That's a little slow for my taste, but it's much more ambitious than any government of Britain had ever considered doing before. The Labour Party, the opposition party, says we have to do it by 2030, which I'm not even sure is technically feasible, but they want to try, which is amazing. Same with Norway and Denmark and Finland. They've made major commitments in recent years to decarbonize very quickly, and I don't think those governments would have felt responsible doing that up until a year or two ago. And I think they feel empowered by this new economic understanding that actually it will be better for us economically to move rather than stand still. But even more important is the way that that new thinking is changing the behavior and planning in the developing world. Because it used to be the case that we felt we had to ask some of these countries to grow more slowly if we wanted them to grow responsibly. And given how so many of them were pulling themselves out of poverty and producing a new global middle class, that felt almost immoral. Given the benefits that we'd had in the first world, to ask those people in the developing world to slow down on their prosperity and consume less and grow less, that seemed like almost an unaskable question. But the government of Indonesia, I think the 5th or 6th biggest economy in the world, they've grown over the last 2 decades dramatically. They're a kind of representative nation in the developing world. They've doubled their per capita income in the last 20 years. They've halved their poverty rate, but they've done so by industrializing, like many other countries in the developing world. They've doubled their carbon emissions over that same period. And they say that now they can halve their emissions, cut them in half by 2030, and still grow at 6% per year, which is faster than the 5% per year that they've grown over the last 2 decades when they've doubled their income. That was a calculus that no nation of the developing world would have entertained even 5 years ago. They felt very clearly, very strongly that in order to grow, they had to burn fossil fuels wherever they could find them. And to me, it's incredibly encouraging to see nations in that part of the world facing the challenges that they're facing, saying, actually, we can grow faster if we're green, grow faster if we're responsible, using renewable energy, than if we were relying on dirty energy. We'll see if that plan comes to pass. We'll see if they honor those paths, if they really fulfill that promise. I think it's possible it is more complicated than they're imagining at the outset, but the fact that they are making that plan and committing to it suggests a whole new way of thinking about this challenge in the developing world, and I hope it really opens up a whole new set of possibilities for the way that we can go forward as a global community, ushering the global poor into a new state of prosperity without challenging or threatening the well-being of the planet as a whole. Because we know from a moral perspective, from an ethical perspective, we've benefited for centuries now from these fossil fuels, and we need to be able to extend that kind of prosperity to those who have not and who are now suffering already the consequences of climate change more intensely than we are. We may also need to pay out reparations and support communities in the global south in their adaptation to climate change. We're not yet at a point in our politics where that seems all that feasible, but I hope we get there, because I hope that climate change can inspire a more empathic response to those who are suffering elsewhere in the world, rather than what we're seeing today in our geopolitics, when so many nations are retreating from those who are suffering, turning their backs on those in pain, and saying we're only going to look out for ourselves. If we hope to address this problem in all its complexity, in all of its moral grotesqueness, it requires some more human sympathy, some more feeling, and some more commitment to those in need, and some retreat from the self-interest that we've embraced as nations in the West certainly over the last few years, and in certain ways over the last decades and even centuries.
Ni un marciano sin lanzar su pregunta. Vamos a...
Now another Martian question.
Forgive my pronunciation. Well, Well, it's true that there's a lot of people who deny climate change, but there's also a large group of people who, although admit that pollution and stuff are bad for the environment, they also say they are skeptical and say that even if we take action in our lives, it's not going to stop anything because of the large businesses that are responsible for most of the pollution in the world. So, what do you recommend us to tell those people? Because I personally think that our little actions that we can take, anything can help change the world. So, what do you think we should tell those people?
Well, my perspective is that individual action can help primarily by bringing about political change. I don't think that we can respond to this crisis at the scale that it demands through individual action alone. It's simply too big for that. We need a new politics and a new policy. But that, to me, is an argument for further engagement, not retreat. And when I look at, say, the school strikers, Fridays for Future, all the other protest movements in the world, I see this as an expression of frustration that the existing system isn't responding to this crisis and at the limits of individual action, but nevertheless driven by people who are responding to that fact and to that frustration by pushing more. That, to me, is the best response. It's the most productive response. And ultimately, if we have a hope of really getting a handle on this crisis, we need to change our politics, which means we need more people frustrated with the status quo and taking action to change it.
A mí me gustaría añadir que...
Well, I'd like to add that I agree with you that on a personal level we can do very little things. We have to do things together in a collective sphere, but that doesn't mean that we should stop doing things at personal level, because if I do things at individual level and I educate my environment, my family, how to do things, positive things at personal level, I will create a core that will grow and that will become stronger. But of course, the ultimate responsibility for change depends on politicians and also on big corporations. Big corporations, they need to assume transformation of economy. They have to go towards a lower carbon economy, a circular economy, and this is what we need. Of course, there's a cost to it. There will be a big investment to be made, but they need to be convinced. But of course, please don't stop doing things at personal level. To set an example is essential, and stop driving, start walking or taking your bicycle. This is an example that we can share, that we can show doing things at personal level is essential. Well, from Twitter, Gregorio Fernandez says, maybe we are waiting for science to save us, and this way we're leaving the situation get worse, and at the end we'll have to pay a cost for the solution. So the question is, will technology save us from this situation?
Whatever response we deliver will involve technology. I think that we don't have a hope of addressing this crisis without, say, replacing our dirty energy infrastructure with renewable energy. And renewable energy is a new technology which we're developing, and we're driving the price down and making it easier to deploy. We probably won't be able to do it without a new kind of battery technology, a new kind of electric grid. We won't be able to do it without a new kind of plane that flies without producing carbon. And we probably won't be able to do it without some more magical sounding technologies too, without some amount of what's called carbon capture, which allows us to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. But of course, those technologies exist today, and I think we sometimes underestimate the difficulty of getting a technology from working in a lab to being deployed at a global scale enough to make a difference. You know, we think if something is working, then therefore the problem is solved. But to take just this one example of carbon capture machines as an example, first of all, it's still much more expensive to take carbon out of the atmosphere than to avoid putting it in there in the first place. But even if that price continues to fall, The UN says that to get safely below 2 degrees would require such a vast deployment of these machines that it would mean building a new industry at least twice as big and maybe 4 times as big as today's oil and gas business. We'd have to do that in the next 10 years. And it took a century and a half for the oil and gas business to be built. There's similar questions about, new nuclear technology, new battery technology. It's one thing to devise something in a lab, and then it's another thing to deploy it at a global scale. And I think in part because of our experience with the internet and with particular apps, which have no real-world element to them, we think that things can just grow infinitely immediately. And climate change is not a problem that can be addressed in that way, which means we have to be much more focused on the tools we know already work, the decarbonizing methods that we know today can work, like replacing dirty energy with renewables, and also things like planting trees. Trees absorb carbon and produce oxygen. If we planted many more of them, we'd be in much better shape. If we stopped deforesting, cutting down forests to produce farmland, we'd be in much better shape. We hear a lot about dietary practices and the consumption of beef and the way that that affects the climate. And it's true that at the moment, animal agriculture has a real big carbon footprint. But it's also the case that traditional pasturing practices and regenerative agriculture can allow us to turn those cattle farms from what are called carbon sources that produce CO2 into carbon sinks that absorb them. We used to practice agriculture that way, but we've stopped. And in part, that's because of some of the corporate interests that you were mentioning a minute ago. It's because agriculture has become such a big business, and those businesses want to behave in a certain way. But we already have the tools we need to use to solve, maybe not solve this problem, to address this problem. And I think it's a mistake to wait for some new magical technology to arrive, because even if it did arrive, it would take decades to deploy at the scale we need, and we simply don't have that time to wait.
Efectivamente, los científicos no.
Yeah, that's right. Scientists are not here to solve this problem. We are here to explain the magnitude of the problem. But it is true that science, and thanks to science, now we are living a life, a quality of life that we had never had before. Science delivers a basic knowledge that's used by those minds that are able to transform this knowledge into a technology that makes our life better. So the solution is not in science per se, but maybe with time technologies can help. But as David has said, this is not for tomorrow, from today to tomorrow. That depends on us. And I think that the other vision, which is the transformational economy, this is what can really help us. Scientists are here to learn, to look for knowledge, to look for solutions, and to deliver to technologies to implement it. And this way life will be better. We are missing a question from one Martian.
Talk about the need for a large-scale action involving companies, but I would like to know if companies are actually listening and if you are optimistic about that large-scale action involving them.
It depends on the company. I think in the last year or two, we've seen real movement in the insurance industry and in a few other places. We've seen huge investments in renewable energy. There's a lot of money focused on delivering that revolution. But I think we haven't yet seen a real reckoning in the financial markets about the future and state of fossil fuel businesses, which are really the biggest villains in this story. They're not the only ones. I think it's important for us to understand the problem, as you were saying earlier, is much more pervasive than the burning of fossil fuels. In fact, the generation of power, which we think of as the whole problem, is really only about 35% of our carbon footprint. But nevertheless, because especially they've engaged in campaigns to slow down progress and confuse the world about the state of climate change, I think that the fossil fuel business is, the worst actor in this saga. And they have not meaningfully begun to change, and their investors have not meaningfully begun to pressure them to change. But I think that some sort of reckoning there is coming. It could happen from moral pressure. It could also happen because investors begin to see the risks associated with being invested in these companies. And it could also come through legal action. In the US, there are a number of lawsuits being brought against fossil fuel businesses for climate damages. This is on the model that was used to really punish the tobacco business a generation ago. And if these lawsuits are successful in the US, the claims being made are so large that they would, practically speaking, put these companies out of business, which could bring about a much faster end to this problem than we could achieve through legislative action or collective action or individual action. I think that's the hope of the people bringing those lawsuits, and we'll see how they proceed. But in general, if we imagine a world that has a stabilized climate 20 or 30 years from now, I think that's a little hard to imagine, but if we do imagine it, it requires the retirement of the entire fossil fuel industry. And that raises the question of what will happen to those businesses and to the assets that they have in the ground. And this is a problem for the financial markets to figure out. You know, the existing oil infrastructure we have today is sufficient to push us past the Paris goals. We don't need to build any new infrastructure at all. And yet China's opening a new coal plant every other day. Presumably, if we retire those pieces of infrastructure and stop extracting that oil and burning that coal, there will have to be some public pressure and maybe even some public payment to incentivize that action. I don't know exactly how that will shake out. I don't know exactly where the pressure will come from or what kind it will be, but it will be a major fight because these are investments that were made not necessarily that long ago, totaling in the billions, hundreds of billions of dollars. And those people are not going to give up those assets all that willingly, which means there needs to be a dramatic campaign to stop them from doing so. I think, again, we're moving in the right direction. We're not yet at the place where the oil business is seen like the tobacco business, but we're moving in that direction. And I think within a few years, it might be embarrassing for anyone to say that they work in the fossil fuel business. Nevertheless, we have to go considerably farther than that if we're hoping to really put these companies out of business, which is what we need to do if we really want to secure a stable climate.
David, muchísimas gracias. Esteban.
David, thank you very much. Esteban, thank you very much. It's been a really interesting conversation. I don't want you to lose your plane. You have to fly out. It's too late. So big applause for these two great presenters. You can follow the debate by reading the book. I had more questions, some topics like the veganism, etc. So another big applause and thank you all for being here today.